Okay guys, we're back one last time to finish up these videos with the Cybran. This is basically demonstrating the RVE, the revamped expansion mod for Supreme Commander 2. It's currently in, I believe they call it 2.0 beta 1.0 phase. And basically they've taken a lot of elements from Supreme Commander and Forged Alliance, including some things like units, and mixed them in with the Supreme Commander 2 game, with new models, new units, plenty of new experimentals, new buildings, and some of the older ones that weren't included in Supreme Commander 2 when they made it. So I guess we'll just go ahead and jump right in. This is the Cybran Land Factory, the Cybran Air Factory, and if you haven't played Supreme Commander 2, it has special add-ons for the factories. It has tactical missile launchers, anti-air turrets, radar stations, and shield generators, which are great for adding some protection to your base. In addition, the Sea Factory down here, you'll notice that it also has the ability to add a torpedo launcher, because it needs to have a way to protect itself from subs. On top of that, these are your research stations as a Cybran. Over here we have the Tech 1 power generators in the back, with Tech 1 mass generators linked up to them. They have two operating modes. You can either enable just generic mass fabrication. These don't actually have any animation, where it costs you a little bit of energy to increase your mass production. Or you can directly buy the mass using energy. And that is the same for all tiers. These are the tier 2 energy generators. These are the tier 2 mass fabricators. These do have an animation. And then over here, of course, the T3 energy generator and the T3 mass fabricator. Down here in the corner we have the T1 units and basic and advanced T1 structures. So to start it off, you have the shield generator, which has a fairly limited radius of effect. The Tech 1 point defense system, that shoots lasers. And the Tech 1 anti-air tower, which you cannot get to ground fire, so there's no way for me to show you what it does. Here we have the Loyalist, and this is not the Loyalist from Supreme Commander Forged Alliance. This was a unit that was made for the vanilla game of Supreme Commander 2. It was given the name Loyalist, but it is of course not a Loyalist. But in the research tree you actually get this really nifty feature called Replicate. Where is that? Here we go. So this one can replicate. Wherein it duplicates itself at a small health cost, but you can only duplicate once, and duplicates cannot duplicate. And considering it costs 300 mass to duplicate, whereas it only costs 35 mass to build, it's not necessarily a great way to bolster your numbers for cheap. Over here, these are the assault bots. They actually look pretty nice. I quite like them. These are new units made by the mods. And then over here you have the Banger mobile anti-air flak artillery, and this unit is actually from Forged Alliance. It was the tier 2 anti-air flak artillery for the Cybrans. And lastly you have a mobile missile launcher called the Viper. It's a quadruped. Looks quite nice. And they shoot a burst of, I believe it's 5 missiles. That's actually looking like 3. Okay. In the Tier 2 side, you do not have an anti-air turret like you do for Tier 1, but you do have the Tier 2 point defense tower. And I believe these actually serve as anti-air if you unlock something within the research tree. I am not entirely sure, and there's no real way for you to check without entering an actual match. But here, you have the artillery. This is a Tech 2 artillery. It has a pretty decent rate of fire. Its range, like its rotation speed, isn't necessarily the greatest, but it is better than the Eons. So if I click Harden, once it finally manages to lay all the way down, it should be able to get 1, maybe 2 shots off before it disengages Harden mode. Yeah, 2 shots. Maybe 3? Nope, just 2. Moving on. Over here we have the Recycler, which is a Cybran-only unit. It will, within a significant radius, it will automatically reclaim any mass in the area. So I've put a little wall section over here so that you can see it. So it's really great to have on the front line base, so it will just automatically start recycling and reclaiming all of the mass from your fallen units as well as your opponents. And this is a stealth field generator. It works the exact same way that the UEF does. You have the enable stealth field, which will cloak your units to radar. Or you have the cloak field, which should cloak your units by vision and make them invisible. And then here we have the Tech 2 shield generator. And of course, like the UEF and the Aeon T2 shield generator, it can tech up to the Tech 3 when you have the proper research prerequisite. Over here, these little guys are actually really, really great. They are anti-air, anti-tactical missile, and mobile shield units. So they're very versatile. It's great to mix several of these anti-air military, as they will provide mobile shields and anti-air defense, as well as defense against anything that shoots missiles. The Hoplite makes a return from Forged Alliance. It works pretty much the exact same way. It has good range, shoots a volley of rockets, and does high damage. These are the Wagner tanks. These also come from Forged Alliance, although I believe this model is completely new. And they are amphibious. I'm not entirely sure. It looks like they're treaded, so they probably work the same way as they did in Forged Alliance, where they, since they're not hover tanks, they actually have to go along the bottom of the sea in order to move. And then these are the true Loyalists, which are called the Loyalist Reborn in this modification. And the reason for that is because, of course, the Tech 1 unit over here is already referred to as the Loyalist. But they have high rapid-fire weapons, great for taking out T2 and T1 units. And something I'll note now is that there is a point in the research tree where the Cybrans get the ability to suicide. Originally, when a Loyalist was killed in Forged Alliance, it would sort of emit an EMP burst. I guess they've sort of taken that concept and applied it to all of your units, as I believe I can detonate these. Yep, I can detonate the Loyalists as well as their clones. So great if you like suicide strikes. Moving on into the Tier 3 area. You have the Tier 3 point defense system, which is the only one that moves all on its own. And it has very, very, very good range, as well as a very rapid fire weapon. It doesn't have the same downtime that the UES does. Admittedly, it probably does less damage per shot. Over here you have the Myrmidon anti-air SAM launcher. Since it's anti-air, I can't get it to ground fire, but it has a very good range and does significant damage to air units in the vicinity. Disable these shields. So here you have the Tier 3 Cybran shield. It has a much larger range than the other two shields, but something about the Cybran Tier 3 shields is that they actually have the ability to tech up. So we'll tell it to do that now, and come back to it in a minute. So these, the nitro tickers, you may not be able to tell by looking at them, but actually you definitely can. That looks like a little grenade. These are the replacements for the T2 fire beetles from Forged Alliance. And if I tell it to attack this spot, it should just move there and blow up. Doesn't look like it's going to. I know I got one to do this earlier, so I'm not entirely sure why it's not doing it. There we go. That worked. So as you can see, it actually has a huge impact and does quite a lot of damage. It instantly took out these 5,800 HP walls. Those aren't wrecks, those are just gone. They have very, very low health though, especially for a Tier 3 unit. Only 405. If I can compare that to the Loyalist over here. The Loyalists have 101, so it only has 400, or it only has 4 times the health. A Loyalist Reborn over here has well over 1,000 health, and that's just in health, not even including its personal shields. Here we have the Tech 3 Mobile Artillery Unit. This is from the vanilla Supreme Commander 2 game. It's basically just been moved from T1 to T3 because there weren't really tech trees in vanilla Supreme Commander 2. This is your mobile anti-air unit. I can't actually get any closer to it than this, unfortunately. But you can see those are its weapons on the sides. They actually look quite nice. And here you have a mobile missile launcher in the Tier 3 range. This is the Cobra. It has, like, Gatling missile launchers, I suppose. These missiles are hard to see when you zoom out. The shield has finished, so you can see it's changed the model. It's also gotten a bigger radius as well as more health. If I upgrade the Tech 2, you'll be able to compare it directly. The Phenom is the T3 heavy tank for the Cybrans. It's limited to only its main cannon, but it has very high health as well as a decent DPS. It's not necessarily the highest DPS unit that you have access to. But here we have the Brick, which has great health, and it basically, or sorry, this is the Brick Mark II. It has 2 more legs than it did in the Supreme Commander Forged Alliance, and it also has a new ability called the Point Defense System, where it will basically deploy into a point defense. Oh, camera freeze. So they're actually quite useful when you build them. You can set them up in specific areas, have some of them deploy as point defense, and just have them hold a position if you need. They keep the same rate of fire and everything. They also have Mega Armor, which many units have, but you can see the animation here. That is an energy cost that reduces their speed, but increases their defenses for a set period of time. And then over here, we have the Shredder Assault Drone, and this is sort of an experimental unit. I guess I'll explain that a little bit later. They have hidden cannons on the inside. The mods have mentioned something about maybe adding crush damage for them making contact, which you can tell why they would say that when it moves. They just look really badass. So here you have the T3 shield, and here's the, I don't know if you want to call it tier 4 or tier 3.5. It's not technically experimental or anything, but it is much better than the standard tier 3 shield. It has a better range. And how much more health does it have? It has 30,000 more shield HP. I believe, excluding the Prime Aegis, this is the strongest shield you can get in the game. So, moving on from that, up here we have our tactical missile defense system, which I can't get the defensive structures to activate. Even if I launch tactical missiles at it, since they're friendly, it won't read. But the Cybrans have access to a unique nuke missile and defense silo. So they combine their nuclear silo with their nuclear missile defense silo. They only get access to store 2 nukes at a time. I believe the other races get 5. But they have the same structure for dealing with tactical missile defense, nuclear missile defense, and nuclear missile launches. So it's actually really convenient. I believe this little guy in the middle is technically supposed to be this, and is what eliminates tactical missiles. But of course, I've built a beautiful nuke. There it goes. All 3 of these will open up when the nuke launches. I'll speed up the gameplay here, because nobody wants to watch the nuke fly for that long. No special animations for the Cybran nuke. I don't know if it has any special effects such as EMP. I would assume it doesn't, considering the Eon having a specific EMP experimental nuke launcher. So I believe that particular aspect of the Cybrans has been removed. Moving on over here, we have a T3 heavy artillery installation. The model is based off of the original from Forged Alliance. I can speed this up a little bit too. It has a decent firing speed for a T3 artillery installation. You can't use this as a reference point though, because the game is being sped up. Accuracy is pretty normal, what you'd expect. That one actually came quite close. Anyway, moving on. Over here we have the T1 air units. This is the Krypton gunship. It doesn't do anything special, works exactly like you expect a gunship to. This is the Omen, the interceptor. Over here we have the Zeus attack bomber. This is straight from Forged Alliance. A nice model, all the same. It has very good firing rate for its T1 bombs, and this is your Tech 1 Scout, the Flying Eyes Air Scout. Over at the T2 side, you have the Renegade gunship, which is the original gunship from Supreme Commander 2. They bumped it up into a T2 slot. Its tail acts as the gun, which is cool, I guess. You have the Dragonfly air transport. It looks basically nothing like the Dragonfly air transport from Forged Alliance, and honestly doesn't look anywhere near as nice. I do believe it has a turret for defense. Yeah, but don't count on it to do any heavy lifting, unless you count on its units. You also have a torpedo bomber with the Cormorant and a fighter bomber with the Gemini. You don't have a air superiority fighter like the UEF have access to at Tier 2. At Tier 3, however, you do with the Scorpion Wing, which also has stealth, very similar to the air superiority fighters from the Cybrans in Forged Alliance. And here you have the Revenant Mark II, which also has stealth, again, very similar to the strategic bomber, the Revenant from Forged Alliance. I'm not sure what kind of bomb this guy drops, so we'll see. Pinpoint accuracy, red glowy thing. You also have access to the Intellitron Air Scout. It's a strange looking insectoid type thing. And the Whaler heavy gunship, which keeps its ability to create false radar signatures for your enemy, which can protect it, especially against anti-air SAMs, because the missiles will fly towards targets that actually don't exist. And we'll cover the naval units here now. This is your T1. You only have one option in T1, as with the other races. It's the Trident class frigate, which is capable of both ground fire and anti-air fire. It's actually a pretty big cannon that takes up the whole nose of the boat. I don't know if boats call the fronts noses. They're not aircraft. It doesn't matter. Anyway, in Tier 2, you have the Executioner class battleship, which is from the vanilla Supreme Commander 2 game. It's pretty ugly. It comes with torpedoes as well as a sort of artillery cannon installation. You have the Salem class destroyer as well. The destroyer has anti-air, has torpedoes, and has a what I will assume is a miniature proton cannon installation. It's a very versatile destroyer, very useful. Now the Cybran class cruiser, which is also from Forged Alliance, as with the other racist cruisers, has a point defense system, but is focused on anti-air. But something unique about the Salem class cruiser is that you don't actually get access to, or sorry, not Salem class, the Siren class cruiser. So you don't get access to the cruiser until after you hit the Tech 3 module in the research tree. So I am not entirely sure if that was intentional, because it is still a Tier 2 unit. It builds from the factory as a Tier 2 unit, and it's listed here as a Tier 2 unit. So I can't really explain that. It may be because of its usefulness as an aircraft docking point, but I really don't know. And then of course you have your submarine killer, the Barracuda. I do not believe it has any form of turret. Nope, just torpedoes. Still pretty cool looking. Something to note out of the Tier 2 naval units, when you have the Land Emergency Galleon System, which is an abbreviation of, abbreviates to LEGS, the Executioner class battleship, the Salem class destroyer, and the Command class carrier, aircraft carrier, can all move on land. And I'll show that in a minute as they're moving. You also have in Tier 3 the Galaxy class battleship from Forged Alliance, which has 2 triple-barrel proton cannons as well as torpedoes for self-defense. The torpedoes actually made it arguably one of the better battleships in Forged Alliance. It depends on how you look at it. It didn't have nearly the same range as the UEFs, but it had very high DPS, and the torpedoes were a part of that. The aircraft carrier can only build T1 units, it appears. Maybe it's because it's moving. We'll see when it's parked. And you have the Plan B strategic missile submarine as well, which carries a nuke, which we can shoot. But we don't need to watch. They also carry regular torpedoes as well as tactical missiles. Same as their use in Forged Alliance. So here it looks like we've almost got the Salem-class destroyer deploying its legs system, or I guess deploying its legs to walk on land. This makes for a very high health unit that you can park on land to guard specific areas if they have access. They do move very slow on land, but you can make up for this in the research tree with the jump jets. So not only do you have legs to be able to move across land, but your naval units also have access to jump jets. This makes them extremely mobile, to a certain extent more mobile than the Aeon Navy, and to a certain extent less so, because they can't just teleport. This guy looks really ugly on land. For some reason they went with a horrible insectoid type look for it. Regardless, there you go. They can all walk on land. And then your only option for an experimental for the sea for the Cybran units is the Kraken experimental submarine. When underwater, it only has access to torpedoes for self-defense or offense, but when it's hit the surface, it actually can use these tentacles with their little laser beams for offense, and it does quite a decent amount of damage. But it's probably not an experimental that you'll be winning the game with. And moving on to the aircraft experimentals. Here we have the experimental giant transport. It has a capacity of 75. It can carry experimental land units. It can carry... I don't think it can carry the naval units. No, it cannot. But it can carry the experimental land units, which I believe cost 50 points each, or a lot of basic military units. They have very high health, and they actually do a decent amount of damage. So you can expect these to be very useful if you want to perform hot drops directly into an opponent's base with a lot of units, especially if you have several of these. And over here we have the Soul Ripper 2 experimental gunship, obviously the replacement for the original Soul Ripper. These are decently tanky, but do quite a lot of damage to ground units. Anti-air is pretty pitiful, if even existent. I don't see any turrets for anti-air, but it might have anti-air. But it does great damage against ground units, and because of its tankiness, it can actually hold its own against anti-air defenses, at least for a little while. The T4 air experimental is the Soulstorm experimental dropship, which can build T1 through T3 ground units. When you build them, it then stores inside. You can unload them anywhere, just like you would with, for example, your giant transport. And they are also armed. So having a couple of these mixed in with some of your giant transports, and you basically got a way to move your entire army, all of your forces, straight onto your opponent's doorstep. Something to note with the Soulstorm is that it's not a drop, it's not a transport like the giant transport. What a great name that is. So because it's not a transport, you can't load units into it. You have to build them from it, I believe. I can check real quick. Yeah, it doesn't give you the option to load it in. So it's something to keep in mind. When you build a Soulstorm, you need to have it start queuing units to build pretty much immediately. And then finally, down here for the experimental land units, you have, this is the Bomb Bouncer experimental reflector shield. I don't think I need to explain what it does, but you do have over here, if you pay 500 energy, you have the Mega Blast manual charge, and when that is charged, you can manually detonate it to do massive area of effect damage around it. Other than that, that's pretty much all it does. Here you have the Cicada, an experimental mobile cloak generator, and I actually really love these guys. They look super cool. And they're mobile cloak generators. What more do you want? You just click a button, and your entire force is now invisible. It's magnificent. I love these guys. I suppose the Raptor is in keeping with the sort of dinosaur-ish theme that the developers gave the Cybran for some of their well, not some of their experimentals. This guy. I guess the modders sort of just rolled with it and made the Raptor. It's pretty cool looking. It has several weapons, and a decent amount of tank and a decent amount of DPS. Overall, I'd say it's pretty average as far as the experimentals go. He who shall not be named here. Gosh, this thing does not deserve the name Megalith. I don't even want to get into that. Over here you have a experimental scorpion. They call it an experimental megabot, the Skoraxis. Skoraxis? Whatever. It doesn't matter. These guys are actually really cool. They have the same sort of laser weapon system that you see on the Kraken, the experimental giant submarine, as well as laser cannons that come from its claws. Anyway, we'll move him out of the way a little bit for this guy. This is the Cybranosaurus Rex, which is a hideously god-awful name. I would call it the C-Rex from now on, just because it's slightly less embarrassing to say. It has a flamethrower in its mouth for some reason, and shoots a massive amount of grenades in an area of effect around it, so it can still defend itself quite well if it's surrounded, but its main weapon is the flamethrower. It also shoots those missiles. As it's Tech 5, it's very tanky and does atrociously high DPS. It's a very good experimental, if not a little bit stupid. Moving on, you have the Avalanche 2 experimental megabot, which is of course inspired by the Avalanche from the, I believe, the Total Annihilation launch. It doesn't look like it keeps the launcher from its tail, but it has lots of guns and looks pretty cool. Tank-wise, it doesn't have nearly as much health as the C-Rex does, but it does do a decent amount of DPS, although, again, not as much as the C-Rex, but it has much better range than the C-Rex does. And one of everybody's personal favorites, the Monkey Lord, experimental spider bot, made a return with the DLC, which you need in order to be able to use the RVE mod. It has the little lasers on the side, as well as its microwave laser. It doesn't rotate, but I suppose that doesn't really matter too much. It has its little exhaust ports on the back. Looks fine. Runs exactly as you expect it to. It has atrociously high DPS and a decent amount of tank. It's no longer amphibious. You can't send it into the ocean as far as... Yeah, you just can't. It won't go. Which is unfortunate. Here you have the Monkey Lord 2, the superior experimental spider bot. Now it's not that much tankier, but it does do a lot more DPS. I want to say it's double. 27,000 DPS versus 14,900. So yes, atrociously high DPS coming from this thing. But aside from the slightly higher tank and much higher DPS, it's basically the exact same thing as the Monkey Lord. It's just slightly more armored looking and has fewer exhaust ports. Functionally, it's the exact same as the Monkey Lord, really. Here you have the Storm Strider, the experimental megabot, which is one of my personal favorites of the new experimentals added into the game. I love the design. It comes with a personal shield generator. So although it's not a personal shield, it's a personal shield generator, so it will protect all of the units within its radius as well. Does a truckload of DPS, and is also a mobile factory. It's a really nice unit. Again, one of my personal favorites. I'm a little biased. I loved the Megalith, and I feel like this is a much better spiritual successor to the Megalith than whatever this thing is. And for the last, this is not a T6 experimental. There are no T6s in the game right now. I just ran out of space to put this guy. It's the Skyadrum Experimental Cyborg Dragon. I assume it's going kind of off of the same concept as the Raptor and the C-Rex did, in a sort of reptilian theme for some of the experimentals. It has some anti-air on its shoulders, as well as these laser gatlings, and I don't really know what those are, but it has lots of weapons on it. It has okay health, and it does an absolutely stupid amount of DPS. So this guy does 32,000, or is that 35,910 DPS, versus the Monkey Lord 2's 27,000. But you have to pay a cost appropriate in order to be able to build one of these. So I believe all that's left is the experimental buildings. Over here, these are the gantries, experimental land gantry and the experimental air gantry. These are where you're building your experimental units from. This is the Experimental Research Center, the Proto-Brain Complex. Now this is basically like a super version of the research stations. It is part of the Supreme Commander 2 vanilla game. And when the brain is attached, it will be making more research points. When the brain is detached, you lose those, if you notice over here, but you can actually use it as an offensive weapon. The brain can fly around, it levitates, and has these laser beams. It kind of works similarly to the Novax from the UEF, but it has a relatively low health, and it's easy for your opponent to take down if he has a good amount of anti-air, which means you'll basically just be throwing mass at him. Something to note though, if it does go down, it will be replaced over time for free by the Experimental Research Center. Over here, next to our nuke, we have the Boomerang Experimental Nuclear Missile Defense System. Now, while cool in theory, the Boomerang Experimental Nuclear Missile Defense, basically, when a nuclear missile comes in, you can launch a redirect nuke at the nuke, so it basically reprograms the nuke to fly back to where it was launched from, and because it is a friendly nuke to your opponent, their anti-nuke systems will not activate to protect him. So he's basically, if you have one of these, he's just nuking himself. The downside is they're really, really expensive, and the redirect nukes are really, really, really expensive, especially compared to just a regular anti-nuke, which these you can place more around your base. So, to be honest, I find the use of the Boomerang quite questionable. I suppose balance isn't quite perfected yet for this mod. It is still in beta. I'd like to see this be a more attractive option to build. And if you remember earlier, I was talking about the Shredder as sort of an experimental unit. Well, that's because you can't build it from the factories. The Shredder can only be built from this, the Rift Cannon, experimental drone cannon. It can only hold 9 at a time, I believe. It's either 9 or 10. 9. It can hold 9 of the Shredder drones. but it works much in the same way as the unit cannon from the UEF. There they all go. We'll speed these guys up. The maximum range from its position over here is basically right to here, so it covers most of the map, but unlike the experimental unit cannon the UEF have, these guys don't die on landing. If you fire 9, you get 9. Every time I've fired them, the same amount that I fired if it landed just fine. So these are, in my opinion, much more useful than the option that the UEF get, because you can fire these wherever you need them to go, and they will land, and you can wreak some havoc with them quite easily. Although it is limited by the fact that you can only send 9 at a time, the units as a whole are actually quite favorable compared to the rest of your T3 units. For example, they do 572 DPS while having nearly 15,000 health, whereas the Brick Mark II only has 12,000 health and does 450 DPS. So it has less DPS and less health. The Phenom Heavy Tank, of course, has less health and less DPS. Brackman Artillery is going to have less health, less DPS. And the Mobile Missile Launcher is going to be the exact same story. So it is a very effective way to get some very powerful units to a specific location without your opponent really being able to do anything about it. And that pretty much covers it. There's one more experimental building, and I believe that's the last of it. So the last experimental building we have here is the Magnetron Experimental Unit Magnet. And if you remember if you know the pull and smash from the Eon Illuminate race, this is basically an experimental building or an experimental structure version of the pull and smash with a slight twist. The Magnetron has a repulsor, so everything within its radius, we can actually check what that radius is. Nope, that's Tech 2. Okay. So, that's the radius. Anything within that radius, any enemy units, would be pushed away. They wouldn't be able to enter. Anything within that radius can also, if you disengage the repulsor, can be attracted and ground up. So having one of these somewhere near your front lines is a great way to completely destroy your opponent's entire military force without him knowing, as long as, of course, he hasn't scouted what you're doing. But there you have it. That's the Cybran units and the Cybran structures. And since there's no Seraphim, I won't be covering them, but I will be including a link to the UEF unit overview and the Aeon Illuminate overview in the description. And thanks for bearing with me. I know this has probably been really boring.